In the lexicon of American history, one name is a synonym for treason: Benedict Arnold. Yet, before his name became a curse, it was a symbol of heroism. Before the traitor, there was the patriot, a brilliant, fearless, and indispensable military commander who won some of the Revolution's most critical victories. So, how did America's most celebrated warrior become its most reviled villain? This is the story of a man whose insatiable ambition and desperate need for recognition were matched only by his battlefield genius. It's a deep dive into a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, public humiliation, financial desperation, and a profound sense of betrayal by the very country he bled to save. To understand the infamous act, we must first confront the complex and tragic hero who committed it, tracing the journey from the heights of glory at Saratoga to the depths of conspiracy at West Point. Imagine, if you will, the bustling yet still very much frontier-like town of Norwich, Connecticut in the mid-1700s. It's a place of cobbled streets, bustling taverns, and the constant hum of trade emanating from its thriving port. This is where Benedict Arnold was born on January 14, 1741, into a family that, for a time, epitomized colonial prosperity. His father, also named Benedict Arnold, was a successful merchant and sea captain, a man of standing in the community. His mother, Hannah Waterman King, came from a respected, well-established family. Young Benedict was one of 6 children, though only he and his sister Hannah would survive to adulthood. This early experience of loss, not uncommon in the era but still deeply impactful, might have subtly contributed to a sense of urgency, a drive to make his mark while he could. The Arnolds initially enjoyed a comfortable life, affording young Benedict the privilege of a good education at a private school, something not universally available in those days. He excelled in arithmetic, showing a keen analytical mind, and was even taught Latin, a mark of intellectual ambition. This early exposure to learning and a relatively privileged upbringing instilled in him a taste for the finer things, a certain expectation of status, and perhaps a quiet disdain for anything that smacked of mediocrity or poverty. He was, by all accounts, a bright and energetic child, known for his leadership among his peers and a daring, often rebellious spirit. There are anecdotes from his youth that hint at his future audacious nature, stories of him organizing snowball fights, like military campaigns, or even attempting to join local military expeditions at a surprisingly young age, much to his mother's consternation. However, the comfortable facade of Arnold's early life began to crumble with terrifying speed. His father, unfortunately, descended into alcoholism, a devastating affliction that slowly but inexorably eroded the family's wealth, reputation, and stability. Business ventures failed, debts mounted, and the family's once proud standing in Norwich began a humiliating decline. The elder Benedict Arnold was arrested multiple times for public intoxication, his once respected name dragged through the mud. This public shame, this forced exposure to the harsh realities of financial ruin and social degradation was deeply scarring for young Benedict. He witnessed firsthand how quickly prosperity could vanish, how easily a family's good name could be sullied. This experience instilled in him a profound aversion to debt and poverty, a burning desire to not only restore his family's fortunes, but to surpass them, to achieve a level of wealth and status that would be beyond reproach, beyond the reach of such humiliating collapse. By the time he was a teenager, the family's finances were in tatters, forcing him to leave school at the age of 14. This was a pivotal moment. The path of formal education, perhaps even university, was abruptly closed. Instead, he was apprenticed to his mother's cousins, the Lathrop brothers, who were successful apothecaries and merchants in Norwich. This apprenticeship was a practical necessity, a means of survival. While it provided him with valuable commercial skills, it was undoubtedly a step down from the trajectory he might have envisioned for himself. The sting of this fall from grace, the contrast between his early promise and his current, more modest circumstances, would simmer beneath the surface of his ambitious spirit. During his apprenticeship, Arnold proved to be an adept and quick learner. He mastered the apothecary trade, understanding the intricacies of medicines and remedies, and he soaked up the principles of commerce. He was astute, energetic, and possessed a natural knack for business. Yet his fiery temper and independent streak often clashed with the rigid structure of apprenticeship. There are accounts of minor insubordinations and a restless energy that couldn't be fully contained by the confines of the shop. This period was crucial in shaping his self-reliance and his growing conviction that he could and should control his own destiny. He learned to negotiate, to manage inventory, to understand market forces, skills that would serve him well both in business and later in military logistics. The family's financial woes deepened with the death of his mother in 1759, followed by his father's demise in 1761. Orphaned and largely left to fend for himself, Benedict, at the age of 20, inherited virtually nothing but his father's debts. This was the crucible of his early adulthood. It solidified his fierce independence and his relentless drive. He saw the world as a place where one had to fight for everything, where respect and security were earned through force of will and shrewd calculation. He was not a man to accept his lot passively. He would make his own fortune, and he would earn his own respect, whatever the cost. With an inheritance of little more than accumulated debts, Arnold made a bold move. He borrowed money, leveraging his growing commercial acumen and charm, to establish his own apothecary and bookstore in New Haven, Connecticut. This act alone speaks volumes about his character. A willingness to take significant risks, a belief in his own abilities, and an almost audacious self-confidence. His business quickly thrived. New Haven, a burgeoning port town, offered ample opportunities, and Arnold seized them with both hands. He was a shrewd merchant, understanding supply and demand, and he was not afraid of venturing into more lucrative, albeit riskier, enterprises. He expanded his business interests to include overseas trade, sending his ships to the West Indies, buying and selling goods like horses, lumber, rum, and slaves. Yes, it's important to acknowledge this uncomfortable truth. Like many successful merchants of his era, Arnold engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. This aspect of his early career, while morally reprehensible by modern standards, was a common if distasteful avenue to wealth in the 18th century. It underscores his single-minded pursuit of financial success and his willingness to participate in the prevailing economic systems, regardless of their ethical implications. These voyages weren't just about profit. They were also about expanding his worldview, gaining an understanding of logistical challenges, navigation, and the intricate networks of colonial commerce. He became a skilled mariner himself, often captaining his own vessels, which further honed his leadership abilities and his capacity to operate effectively in high-stakes environments. By the late 1760s, Benedict Arnold was a wealthy man, respected in New Haven for his business acumen, and increasingly influential. He built a grand home, established a reputation, and began to enjoy the trappings of success that had so cruelly eluded his father. He married Margaret Mansfield in 1767, the daughter of a local sheriff, and together they had 3 sons. This period of prosperity, however, was not without its turbulence. Arnold's temper remained a prominent feature of his personality. He was quick to take offense, prone to heated arguments, and not averse to settling disputes with his fists if necessary. He was a man who demanded respect and reacted fiercely to any perceived slight or challenge to his authority. There's an account of him horsewhipping a merchant who had insulted him, a testament to his volatile nature and his unwillingness to back down. The political climate of the colonies was by this time growing increasingly volatile. Tensions with Great Britain were escalating over issues of taxation and representation. Arnold, as a prominent merchant deeply involved in colonial trade, was acutely aware of the economic impact of British policies. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the growing infringements on colonial self-governance directly affected his livelihood and his sense of autonomy. He was a vocal opponent of these policies, not merely out of patriotism, but out of a pragmatic understanding of how they threatened his prosperity and the economic freedom of the colonies. He joined the Sons of Liberty, a clandestine organization dedicated to resisting British tyranny, demonstrating his early commitment to the burgeoning revolutionary cause. His motivations at this point were a complex blend of self-interest, a desire for economic freedom, and a genuine belief in the rights of colonists. He saw an opportunity to not only secure his own wealth, but to contribute to a larger cause that promised a more just and prosperous future. One of the less discussed but emotionally significant incidents that shaped Arnold's early revolutionary fervor occurred in 1775. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, news of the conflict reached New Haven like wildfire. Arnold, then a captain in the Connecticut militia, immediately rallied his company and demanded ammunition from the town's selectmen to march to Boston and join the fight. The selectmen, hesitant and cautious, initially refused. Arnold, fueled by his characteristic impatience and a burning desire for action, confronted them, famously declaring that if they wouldn't provide the ammunition, he would break into the powder house and take it by force, adding, "None but the Almighty God shall prevent my marching." His sheer force of will, his willingness to defy local authority for what he believed was a higher cause, compelled the selectmen to relent. This incident perfectly encapsulates the raw, unbridled energy and audacious spirit that defined Benedict Arnold in the early days of the Revolution. He was a man of action, unafraid to challenge convention or authority when convinced of his own righteousness. This early period of Arnold's life, marked by early privilege, humiliating decline, relentless self-made success, and a volatile, ambitious temperament, provides the essential backdrop for his later actions. He was a man driven by a profound need for recognition and security, constantly fighting against the specter of his father's failures. He learned that the world was a harsh place where one had to seize opportunities, often ruthlessly, and that self-reliance was paramount. He was a patriot, yes, but a patriot with a deep-seated vulnerability, a craving for respect and a sensitivity to perceive slights that would, in time, become his undoing. The foundations of both his greatness and his eventual infamy were laid in these formative years, a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, pride, and an almost obsessive desire to prove his worth. The Revolution offered him a stage, a chance to achieve the ultimate recognition, but it also exposed the very cracks in his character that would lead to his tragic downfall. The shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 was not just a signal for rebellion. For Benedict Arnold, it was a call to action, a summons to the destiny he had been chasing his entire life. The world of ledgers and shipping manifests was suddenly too small for his colossal ambition and restless energy. Here was a cause worthy of his talents, a conflict where a man could win immortal glory, the kind of honor and respect that could finally erase the stain of his family's past. As we saw, he didn't wait for an invitation. He forced the issue in New Haven, securing supplies through sheer force of will, and marched his militia company toward the epicenter of the conflict in Massachusetts. But Arnold's vision extended far beyond the siege lines of Boston. He possessed a strategic mind that saw the bigger picture, and his gaze was fixed northward on a prize of immense importance: Fort Ticonderoga. Nestled at the southern end of Lake Champlain in New York, Fort Ticonderoga was a stone behemoth, a linchpin in the chain of communication and transport between British-held Canada and the 13 colonies. More importantly, it housed a massive arsenal of heavy cannons, artillery, and mortars, precisely the kind of firepower the fledgling, ill-equipped Continental Army desperately needed to drive the British from Boston. While the politicians in the Continental Congress debated and dithered, Arnold formulated a daring plan. He presented his idea to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, which, impressed by his fervor and strategic insight, granted him a colonel's commission and authorized him to raise a force to capture the fort. Here we encounter the first significant complication in Arnold's military career, a theme that would repeat with devastating consequences: the clash of ego and authority. As Arnold rode north recruiting men, he was unaware that another, very different force was converging on the same target. This was Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, a rough-hewn, fiercely independent militia from the territory that would become Vermont. Allen was a charismatic giant of a man, a frontier folk hero who commanded the unswerving loyalty of his followers. He, too, had his eyes on Ticonderoga, operating under a vague authority from Connecticut. When Arnold arrived, brandishing his official commission from Massachusetts and expecting to take sole command, he was met with outright hostility. The Green Mountain Boys made it clear they would only follow their leader, Ethan Allen. They threatened to abandon the entire enterprise if this polished, uniformed officer from Connecticut tried to boss them around. For a man like Benedict Arnold, so conscious of rank, honor, and official sanction, this was a galling insult. He had the legitimate authority, the strategic plan, yet he was being sidelined by a rustic militia leader. A lesser man might have stormed off in a huff, but Arnold's pragmatism and his burning desire to see the mission succeed overrode his pride, at least for the moment. After a heated confrontation, a tense and fragile compromise was reached. Arnold and Allen would share command. On the night of May 10th, 1775, they led a small force of about 80 men across the dark waters of Lake Champlain. They landed near the fort, which was manned by a sleepy, unsuspecting British garrison of fewer than 50 men. In the pre-dawn gloom, they stormed the gate. The surprise was total. Legend has it that Allen burst into the commandant's quarters and demanded the fort's surrender. In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Within minutes and without a single shot being fired in anger, the formidable fortress was in American hands. It was a stunning, almost bloodless victory, and its strategic importance cannot be overstated. The cannons captured at Ticonderoga would later be famously hauled across the mountains by Henry Knox in the dead of winter, positioned on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston, and used to force the British to evacuate the city. But for Arnold, the victory was bittersweet. In the official reports and popular accounts, his role was often minimized. The story became about the charismatic Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys. Arnold, the man with the official commission and the initial strategic vision, was often relegated to a footnote. He had fought for joint command and shared in the glory, but in his mind, he had been denied the full credit he so richly deserved. This was the first cut, a deep and painful reminder that battlefield success did not always translate into the kind of personal recognition he craved. The seeds of resentment, planted long ago in his youth, had found fertile, if rocky, ground. Despite his frustrations at Ticonderoga, Arnold's ambition was not dampened. In fact, it soared to new, almost unimaginable heights. He conceived of an even bolder plan, a full-scale invasion of Canada. He believed that the French-Canadian population would rise up and join the American cause, throwing off British rule and adding a 14th colony to the Revolution. The Continental Congress, buoyed by the success at Ticonderoga, approved a two-pronged invasion. One force under General Richard Montgomery would advance north along the traditional Lake Champlain route. The second and far more audacious prong would be commanded by Colonel Benedict Arnold. He proposed to lead a force of over 1,000 men on a grueling overland trek through the dense, uncharted wilderness of Maine, emerging from the forest to strike at the heart of British power in Canada, the walled city of Quebec. The expedition that followed is one of the most harrowing and heroic chapters in the annals of American military history. In September 1775, Arnold's force set out from Massachusetts. What they faced was a nightmare. The maps they had were inaccurate. The terrain was far more brutal than anticipated, and their specially constructed transport boats, the bateaux, were made of green wood and began to leak and fall apart almost immediately. Autumn rains turned the rivers into raging torrents, and the land into a quagmire of mud. They had to constantly portage their heavy boats and dwindling supplies around waterfalls and through dense, tangled forests. The conditions were beyond comprehension. Rations were quickly exhausted. The men were reduced to eating their leather shoes, cartridge boxes, and even their pet dogs. The cold was relentless. Sickness, dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox swept through the ranks. Men grew weak, their bodies racked with starvation and fatigue. A significant portion of the force under a subordinate officer lost their nerve and turned back, taking a large chunk of the remaining supplies with them. It was a moment that would have broken most commanders, but Benedict Arnold was not most commanders. He was a force of nature. He led from the front, sharing the hardships, wading through icy rivers, and pushing his men onward through sheer indomitable will. He was everywhere at once, encouraging the weary, disciplining the unruly, and projecting an aura of absolute confidence even as the situation grew more desperate. One soldier wrote in his diary, "He was a very humane and heroic commander. He did not leave us to wade through the river and stay on the other side, but came over with us to the last man." This was Arnold at his absolute best, a leader of men, a master of motivation, and a man of almost superhuman endurance. His physical and mental toughness in the face of such overwhelming adversity was nothing short of legendary. After a brutal 350-mile march that took nearly 2 months, a starving skeletal force of about 600 men, less than 2/3 of the original number, finally stumbled out of the wilderness onto the banks of the St. Lawrence River opposite Quebec. They were a terrifying sight, clad in rags, but their spirit was unbroken. Arnold, however, had lost the element of surprise. He was forced to wait for Montgomery's force to arrive from Montreal before launching an attack. The assault finally came on the last day of the year, December 31st, 1775, in the midst of a blinding blizzard. It was a desperate gamble. As Arnold led his men in a charge through the narrow streets of the city's lower town, a musket ball shattered his left leg. He collapsed in the snow, bleeding profusely, his bone split to pieces. He tried to press on, but the pain and loss of blood were too great. He was carried, against his protest, to the rear. Without his leadership, the attack faltered. General Montgomery was killed in his own assault on the other side of the city, and a large portion of the American force, including the famed frontiersman Daniel Morgan, was surrounded and captured. The Battle of Quebec was a disastrous defeat. Yet Arnold's heroism was undeniable. Wounded and in agony, he refused to retreat. With the remnants of his battered army, he established a loose siege of the city, harassing the British garrison throughout the harsh Canadian winter. His bravery and tenacity were celebrated throughout the colonies. For his actions, the Continental Congress promoted him to brigadier general. He had paid a heavy price. His leg would trouble him for the rest of his life, leaving him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. But he had earned his glory. He had literally bled for the revolution, proving his courage and commitment beyond any doubt. The man who had once been a merchant was now unequivocally a hero. His next great contribution came nearly a year later, in the autumn of 1776. The British, having driven the Americans out of Canada, were preparing a massive invasion down Lake Champlain, aiming to capture Albany and sever New England from the rest of the colonies. It was a strategy that could have ended the war. The Americans had to stop them, but they had a problem. The British had a professional navy, and the Americans had nothing on the lake. Once again, Benedict Arnold's unique combination of skills came to the fore. Drawing on his experience as a sea captain and merchant, he took charge of a seemingly impossible task: building an American fleet from scratch on the shores of Lake Champlain. Throughout the summer, he oversaw a frantic, around-the-clock construction effort. Trees were felled and turned into crude but functional gunboats, known as gondolas and galleys. He sourced cannons, recruited sailors from among the ranks of soldiers, and personally supervised every detail. It was a masterpiece of logistics, improvisation, and sheer determination. By October, he had assembled a small makeshift fleet of 16 vessels. He knew he was hopelessly outgunned by the powerful British fleet that was sailing south to meet him. A direct confrontation in open water would be suicide. So, he devised a brilliant tactical plan. He hid his small fleet in the narrow rocky channel between Valcour Island and the western shore of the lake. It was a perfect trap. The British fleet, sailing south with a strong wind, sailed right past his position without seeing him. To attack, the larger British ships had to turn and beat back against the wind, a slow and clumsy maneuver that negated their superior long-range firepower and forced them to fight Arnold's fleet on his terms in close quarters, where his smaller, more maneuverable boats had an advantage. The Battle of Valcour Island, fought on October 11, 1776, was a brutal day-long slugfest. Arnold was in the thick of the fighting, moving from his flagship to another vessel when it was heavily damaged, personally aiming cannons and rallying his men. By the end of the day, the American fleet was shattered, but it had not been destroyed. Under the cover of a foggy night, Arnold executed a daring escape, slipping his remaining boats right through the British line. The British pursued him over the next 2 days, eventually catching and destroying most of what was left of his fleet. Arnold was among the last to abandon ship, personally setting his own flagship ablaze to prevent its capture, and then leading his surviving men on a grueling retreat through the woods to Fort Ticonderoga. On paper, Valcour Island was a tactical defeat. Arnold had lost almost his entire fleet. But in strategic terms, it was one of the most important victories of the war. His audacious stand had delayed the powerful British invasion for an entire year. By the time the battle was over, it was too late in the season for the British to continue their advance. They were forced to withdraw to Canada for the winter. That delay was absolutely critical. It bought the Continental Army precious time to regroup and reinforce its northern defenses. It saved the Revolution in 1776 and set the stage for the pivotal American victory at Saratoga the following year, a victory in which Arnold would again play the leading role. Yet again, however, the full brilliance of his accomplishment was not appreciated by many in the Continental Congress. They saw the loss of ships, not the invaluable gift of time he had secured, while George Washington and other senior military leaders understood the strategic genius of what Arnold had done. The politicians were less impressed. For Arnold, this was becoming a frustrating pattern. He had sacrificed his health in Quebec and risked his life at Valcour Island, twice saving the northern frontier, yet he felt his contributions were consistently misunderstood and undervalued. He was a celebrated hero, yes, but the recognition never seemed to match the scale of his sacrifice. The pain in his leg was a constant physical reminder of what he had given, while the slights from Congress were a constant emotional reminder of what he felt he was being denied. The hero of the North was at the zenith of his fame, but the shadows of discontent were lengthening, and the path ahead was fraught with political intrigue that would test his loyalty to its breaking point. The year is 1777, and the American Revolution hangs by a thread. The British, still smarting from their forced evacuation of Boston and the unexpected delay caused by Benedict Arnold's heroism at Valcour Island, launched a massive three-pronged offensive designed to crush the rebellion once and for all. The central thrust, and the most dangerous, was spearheaded by General John Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, a flamboyant and overly confident British commander. His plan was to lead a powerful army, complete with Hessians, Loyalists, and Native American allies, south from Canada down Lake Champlain and the Hudson River corridor, aiming to link up with British forces from New York City. The goal was to split the colonies in two, isolating radical New England from the more moderate southern states. It was a brilliant strategy, and if successful, it would almost certainly have ended the war in Britain's favor. The American response was disorganized, and command of the crucial northern department of the Continental Army was mired in political infighting. General Philip Schuyler, a respected but often maligned New Yorker, was initially in command. As Burgoyne's forces advanced, Fort Ticonderoga, so heroically captured by Arnold and Allen just 2 years earlier, was controversially abandoned without a fight. The American morale plummeted. Amidst this gloom, Benedict Arnold was sent north by George Washington himself. Washington knew Arnold's capabilities, his fighting spirit, and his unparalleled experience in the Northern Theater. Arnold arrived as a divisional commander serving under General Schuyler. He immediately set about trying to rally the demoralized troops. He was also instrumental in devising tactics to slow Burgoyne's advance, such as felling trees across roads and destroying bridges, turning the dense wilderness into an even more formidable obstacle. However, political machinations in the Continental Congress were in full swing. Schuyler, due to various setbacks and internal rivalries, was replaced as commander of the Northern Department by General Horatio Gates, a meticulous but less aggressive officer who harbored a deep personal animosity towards Arnold. Gates had a talent for self-promotion and was keenly aware of how to curry favor with Congress. The appointment of Gates was a bitter pill for Arnold. He viewed Gates as an inferior strategist and a man whose career had benefited from political connections rather than battlefield prowess. The seeds of discord were already sown before the major engagements even began. Despite the tension with Gates, Arnold found an opportunity to showcase his tactical brilliance. As Burgoyne's Native American allies and Loyalist Rangers began to terrorize the frontier settlements, particularly after the brutal murder of Jane McCrea, American sentiment against the British surged. Arnold dispatched a force under General Nicholas Herkimer to relieve Fort Stanwix, which was under siege by a British detachment. More significantly, he masterminded a brilliant psychological operation. He employed a loyalist known to have learning difficulties, who, after being captured by the Americans, was persuaded or coerced to spread exaggerated tales of an overwhelmingly large American relief force. This ruse, combined with real American reinforcements, panicked the Native American auxiliaries and loyalists, leading them to abandon the siege and contributing to Burgoyne's growing isolation. This cunning maneuver, often overlooked, demonstrates Arnold's intelligence and his understanding of unconventional warfare. As Burgoyne continued his slow, grinding advance, the two armies finally confronted each other near Saratoga, New York, in September and October of 1777. The ensuing battles, often referred to collectively as the Battles of Saratoga, would prove to be the turning point of the American Revolution. The first major engagement occurred on September 19, 1777, at Freeman's Farm. It was a brutal seesaw battle that lasted for hours. Gates, ever cautious, initially ordered his troops to hold their defensive positions, but Arnold, always preferring aggressive action, famously disobeyed orders. He rode forward, personally leading his division into the thick of the fight. He saw that Burgoyne's right flank, under General Simon Fraser, was vulnerable, and he pushed relentlessly to exploit it. He was a whirlwind on the battlefield, riding back and forth, rallying his men, seemingly oblivious to the danger. An eyewitness described him as like a madman, throwing himself into the most dangerous parts of the fighting. His presence was electrifying, his leadership inspiring. The battle raged fiercely, with control of the farm changing hands multiple times. Arnold's tactical acumen was on full display as he maneuvered his troops to counter British advances and exploit weaknesses. Although the Americans eventually fell back to their defensive lines as night fell, they had inflicted heavy casualties on the British and prevented Burgoyne from achieving his objective of breaking through the American center. Gates, however, despite the tactical success, refused to acknowledge Arnold's decisive role. Instead, he stripped Arnold of his command, effectively confining him to camp and giving credit to other officers in his reports to Congress. This was a profound humiliation for Arnold, a public rebuke that cut him to the core. He had once again risked his life, led with unparalleled bravery, and arguably saved the day, only to be cast aside by a rival. He was furious, threatening to resign and return home. Generals Philip Schuyler and Benjamin Lincoln, along with other officers who recognized Arnold's critical contribution, implored him to stay, knowing that his unique fighting spirit was indispensable. The tension between Arnold and Gates simmered for weeks, threatening to boil over. The American army waited, entrenched in their fortifications on Bemis Heights, while Burgoyne's forces, short on supplies and increasingly desperate, dug in just a mile away. Morale in the British camp plummeted. Burgoyne knew he had to break through or face complete annihilation. The decisive engagement came on October 7th, 1777. Burgoyne launched a reconnaissance in force, attempting to probe the American left flank. The battle quickly escalated. Once again, Gates remained in his tent, cautious and reserved. But Arnold, despite having no official command, could not sit idly by. He heard the sounds of battle, felt the adrenaline surge through his veins, and knew that the fate of the nation was at stake. In a moment of pure, defiant courage, he rode onto the battlefield without orders, literally galloping past Gates's tent. Accounts differ on whether Gates tried to stop him, but Arnold, ignoring all protocols, plunged headlong into the fray. He was a force unleashed. Arnold was in a rage, one observer noted, a demon in human form. He rallied disorganized troops, personally led charges, and seemed to be everywhere at once. He rode fearlessly into the hottest parts of the fighting, drawing enemy fire, his distinctive uniform and larger-than-life presence making him a conspicuous target. He directed troops to capture specific redoubts, identified critical weaknesses in the British line, and inspired his men with his sheer audacity. The Hessians, renowned for their discipline, were particularly vulnerable to Arnold's relentless charges. His ultimate target was the Balcarres Redoubt, a formidable British strongpoint. After a fierce assault, the redoubt was taken. Then, without pausing, Arnold spurred his horse towards the Bremen Redoubt, another heavily fortified position defended by Hessian troops. This was the final critical breakthrough needed to shatter Burgoyne's line. As he led the charge against the Bremen Redoubt, his horse was shot from under him, collapsing and pinning his already injured left leg beneath it. A Hessian soldier then shot him again in the same leg, shattering his shin bone. "Glory to God! I am in the leg again," Arnold reportedly exclaimed, his face contorted in pain and triumph. His men, seeing their wounded commander, surged forward with renewed fury and overwhelmed the Hessian defenders. The Bremen Redoubt fell, and with it, Burgoyne's hopes. The British line was broken, their army in disarray. Arnold, bleeding profusely and in immense pain, had once again secured a decisive victory through sheer will and reckless bravery. His leg was mangled, his career in jeopardy, but his actions at Saratoga, defying orders and leading from the front, were instrumental in forcing Burgoyne's surrender just 10 days later. This was the moment that brought France fully into the war as an American ally, providing the crucial naval power, troops, and financial aid that ultimately secured American independence. Benedict Arnold was undeniably the hero of Saratoga. But once again, the political games began. Gates, despite being largely absent from the actual fighting, claimed the lion's share of the credit for the victory. In his official reports to Congress, he conspicuously omitted Arnold's name, ensuring that he alone would receive the laurels. The injustice was staggering. Arnold, lying wounded and in agony, heard the news of Gates's accolades and his own exclusion with a bitterness that deepened the wounds on his leg and in his soul. He had bled for his country, sacrificed his health, and won a victory that fundamentally altered the course of the war, only to be publicly slighted and denied the recognition he felt he so desperately deserved. This was the critical juncture, the pivot point where heroism began its agonizing slide toward infamy. Arnold, a man whose entire life had been defined by a need for recognition and status, felt profoundly betrayed by the very cause he had so valiantly served. The pain of his physical wounds was compounded by the searing agony of perceived dishonor. He saw other, less capable men promoted over him, men who lacked his battlefield prowess and his willingness to sacrifice. He felt unappreciated, undervalued, and ultimately unloved by the revolution he had so passionately embraced. Compounding his personal grievances were growing financial difficulties. Arnold had invested heavily in his military campaigns, often using his own funds to equip his troops when Congress failed to provide. He kept meticulous records, expecting to be reimbursed, but the fledgling American government was notoriously slow and disorganized in its payments. His claims were often disputed, audited, and delayed, further fueling his resentment. He began to feel that his sacrifices were not only unacknowledged, but also uncompensated. This gnawing financial pressure, combined with his mounting medical bills and his wife Margaret's costly demands — she had died in 1775 in Arnold — was left to care for their 3 young sons. A significant financial burden created a perfect storm of vulnerability. After Saratoga, Arnold spent months recovering from his severe leg wound. The injury left him with a permanent limp, a constant source of pain, and a grim reminder of his sacrifice. While recuperating, he was stationed in Philadelphia, the vibrant cosmopolitan capital of the new nation. Here his life took another significant turn. He met and fell deeply in love with Peggy Shippen, the beautiful, charismatic, and much younger daughter of a prominent Loyalist-leaning Philadelphia family. Peggy was accustomed to a lavish lifestyle, and Arnold, eager to impress her and maintain his image as a successful general, began to live far beyond his means. He plunged deeper into debt, seeking to maintain a level of luxury and social standing that was simply unsustainable for a Continental Army officer. Their marriage in 1779 brought him great personal happiness, but it also entangled him further in a web of financial strain and social pressures that would contribute to his ultimate downfall. Philadelphia was also a hotbed of political intrigue and social division. Many influential families retained strong Loyalist sympathies, and Peggy herself moved in these circles. Arnold found himself increasingly exposed to the arguments for reconciliation with Britain, to the growing skepticism about the long-term viability of the American cause, and to the glittering allure of British wealth and power. The contrast between his personal financial struggles, the constant bureaucratic slights from Congress, and the apparent stability and generosity of the British became starker and more tempting. The transformation from hero to potential traitor was not sudden. It was a gradual, agonizing process, a slow poisoning of a once fierce loyalty. It was fueled by a potent cocktail of wounded pride, unacknowledged sacrifice, mounting debt, and the subtle influences of a world that offered a seductive alternative to his current woes. The man who had once declared, "None but the Almighty God shall prevent my marching," was now contemplating a different kind of march, one that would lead him away from the very revolution he had so valiantly saved. The seeds of treason, sown in the fertile ground of grievance and despair, were about to bear their bitter fruit. Following the British evacuation in the summer of 1778, George Washington, in a gesture of both trust and concern for his wounded general, appointed Benedict Arnold as the military governor of Philadelphia. On the surface, it was a prestigious post. Philadelphia was the nation's capital, its largest city, and its cultural and political heart. For a man of Arnold's ambition and taste for the finer things, it should have been a triumphant assignment. It was a chance to recover from his grievous wound, to engage with the nation's leaders, and to bask in the glory he had earned at Saratoga. Instead, Philadelphia became a gilded cage, a political snake pit, where his remaining loyalty would be tested, twisted, and ultimately broken. The Arnold who rode into Philadelphia was a changed man. He was no longer the vigorous, unstoppable force of nature who had conquered the Maine wilderness. He was in constant agonizing pain from his shattered leg, which doctors had wanted to amputate. He had refused, but the leg was now several inches shorter than the other, requiring a built-up shoe and leaving him with a pronounced awkward limp. This physical disability was a constant, humiliating reminder of his sacrifice, and it chafed against his proud, athletic nature. He was a warrior confined to a desk, a man of action forced into a world of paperwork and politics, a world for which his direct, often abrasive personality was profoundly ill-suited. Philadelphia itself was a city deeply scarred and divided by the recent British occupation. Society was a treacherous cocktail of ardent patriots, secret loyalists, and pragmatic opportunists who had collaborated with whichever side held power. It was a city of whispers, gossip, and rampant political intrigue. Here, fortunes were being made through war profiteering, and accusations of corruption were hurled like cannonballs. Arnold, with his lavish tastes and a certain naivete about the intricacies of political maneuvering, stepped directly into this minefield. His marriage to Margaret Peggy Shippen in April 1779 only deepened his entanglement. Peggy was the toast of Philadelphia society, a young woman of exquisite beauty, sharp intelligence, and undeniable charm. She was also the daughter of Judge Edward Shippen, a man of conservative, loyalist-leaning sympathies, who had tried to remain neutral in the conflict. During the British occupation, Peggy had been a prominent figure in the social scene, forming close friendships with several British officers, most notably the dashing and cultured Major John Andre. Her world was one of elegant balls, sophisticated conversation, and a level of refinement that stood in stark contrast to the rough-hewn austerity of many revolutionary leaders. Arnold was utterly captivated by Peggy. He was a 38-year-old widower with 3 sons. She was a vibrant 18-year-old. He saw in her a chance for a new life, a partner who could help him achieve the social status he had always made. To win her and to keep her in the style to which she was accustomed, Arnold began to spin with reckless abandon. They moved into the Penn Mansion, the finest house in the city, and hosted extravagant parties that became the talk of the town. He bought her expensive gifts, maintained a large household staff, and lived the life of a wealthy aristocrat, all on the meager and often unpaid salary of a Continental Army general. This lifestyle plunged him ever deeper into a chasm of debt. His old business ventures were failing, and his appeals to Congress for reimbursement for his wartime expenses were tangled in a bureaucratic nightmare. Auditors questioned his receipts, politicians debated his claims, and payment was endlessly delayed. He saw men he considered profiteers and shirkers growing rich from the war, while he, a wounded hero, was facing financial ruin. The injustice of it all gnawed at him, feeding a growing cynicism about the very cause for which he had sacrificed so much. Was this the virtuous republic he had fought to create? A place where heroes were left to beg while speculators thrived? His precarious situation was made infinitely worse by his political enemies. His primary antagonist was Joseph Reed, the president of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. Reed was a radical patriot, a humorless and zealous politician who viewed Arnold with deep suspicion. He saw Arnold's lavish lifestyle, his association with loyalist-leaning families through his wife, and his often arrogant demeanor as evidence of a corrupt and aristocratic character, antithetical to the spirit of the Revolution. Reed and his council began a systematic campaign to discredit Arnold, compiling a list of charges against him. The accusations were a mix of the serious and the trivial, including using government wagons for personal profit and issuing a secret pass for a loyalist-owned ship to leave port. In May of 1779, Reed publicly filed formal charges against Arnold, demanding a court-martial. For Arnold, this was the ultimate betrayal. He, the hero of Quebec and Saratoga, was being publicly accused of petty crimes by politicians he viewed as cowards and schemers. He wrote impassioned letters to George Washington, proclaiming his innocence and pleading for a swift trial to clear his name. He saw the entire affair as a politically motivated attack on his honor, a public humiliation designed to destroy him. The court-martial dragged on for months, a slow, agonizing process that kept Arnold's name mired in scandal. Finally, in January 1780, the verdict came. He was acquitted of the most serious charges, but the court found him guilty on 2 minor counts: the questionable use of the wagons and the imprudent issuing of the pass. The sentence was a formal reprimand to be delivered by the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. While the verdict was a partial vindication, the sentence was a crushing blow to Arnold's fragile ego. The idea of being officially rebuked, no matter how gently, by the one man he truly respected was more than his pride could bear. Washington, caught between his duty and his personal affection for Arnold, carried out the sentence with as much delicacy as possible. His reprimand spoke of Arnold's past services with the highest approbation, but noted his current actions as imprudent and improper. For Arnold, the carefully chosen words didn't matter. It was a black mark on his record, a permanent stain on his honor. In his mind, the republic he had served had now officially turned against him. This, for Benedict Arnold, was the point of no return. It was in this crucible of debt, humiliation, and rage that the dark alliance was forged. Sometime in the spring of 1779, even as he was publicly defending his honor, Arnold made his first treasonous overture to the British. The precise role Peggy played in this is a subject of intense historical debate. For centuries, she was portrayed as an innocent victim, a loyal wife tragically caught in her husband's web of deceit. However, modern scholarship suggests she may have been a much more active participant, perhaps even an instigator. She was the one with the established connection to Major John André, now the head of British intelligence under Sir Henry Clinton in New York. Did she encourage her embittered husband? Did she facilitate the initial contact? The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Using coded letters written in invisible ink and transported through a chain of intermediaries, Arnold, under the codename Mr. Moore, began a secret correspondence with André, who used the codename John Anderson. Initially, Arnold offered intelligence, providing valuable information on American troop movements and strategic plans. But Sir Henry Clinton wanted a prize far greater than simple espionage. He wanted a single devastating blow that could cripple the American war effort and bring the rebellion to its knees. And Benedict Arnold was uniquely positioned to deliver it. The prize was West Point, perched high above a strategic S-curve in the Hudson River. The fortress at West Point was the most important military installation in America. Its interlocking forts and massive chains stretched across the river, effectively blocking British naval passage and securing the vital communication lines between New England and the rest of the states. Its loss would be a strategic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. George Washington himself called it the key to America. In the summer of 1780, Arnold began a calculated campaign to gain command of this fortress. He wrote to Washington, lamenting that his still painful leg wound prevented him from taking an active field command. He presented himself as a wounded veteran, capable only of a stationary garrison post. Washington, full of sympathy for the hero of Saratoga, and completely unaware of his secret correspondence, fell for the ruse. On August 3, 1780, he granted Arnold's request, placing the key to America directly into the hands of a man who was actively plotting to give it away. With the prize in his grasp, the negotiations intensified. Arnold demanded 20,000 pounds, a king's ransom equivalent to millions of dollars today, for the surrender of West Point, its 3,000 men, and its vast stores of munitions. The plan was audacious. Arnold would systematically weaken the fort's defenses, dispersing his troops to outlying areas and neglecting critical repairs. He would then coordinate with Sir Henry Clinton to stage a mock British attack. Arnold would ensure the fort's surrender was swift and seemingly inevitable, allowing him to play the part of a valiant but overwhelmed commander. To finalize the intricate details of the surrender, a face-to-face meeting between Arnold and André was deemed essential. After several failed attempts, a rendezvous was set for the night of September 21st, 1780. André sailed up the Hudson River aboard the British sloop of war, the Vulture. Just before midnight, he was rowed ashore to a dark, secluded spot on the riverbank, where Benedict Arnold was waiting in the shadows. For hours, the two men huddled together, poring over maps and finalizing the last details of the treacherous plot. The fate of the revolution was being decided in a whispered conversation under a moonless sky. But as dawn approached, their carefully laid plans began to unravel. American sentries on the shore, spotting the Vulture at anchor, opened fire with a small cannon. The ship, fearing damage, was forced to weigh anchor and retreat downriver, leaving Major John André stranded behind enemy lines. He was trapped. His British uniform now made him an obvious spy. Arnold, realizing the immense danger, gave André civilian clothes and a passport under his assumed name, John Anderson. He also, in a catastrophic error of judgment, gave André 6 crucial documents detailing West Point's defenses, hiding them between his stockings and his boots. André now had no choice but to attempt a perilous overland journey back to British lines, traveling through a lawless stretch of land known as the Neutral Ground, a notorious haunt of bandits and irregular patrols. The entire conspiracy, the culmination of over a year of secret plotting, now rested on the shoulders of one man and the contents of his boots. Major John André, the charming and confident chief of British intelligence, was in a desperate situation. Stranded behind American lines, forced out of his officer's uniform and into civilian disguise, he was making his way on horseback through the perilous neutral ground of Westchester County, New York. This was a lawless 30-mile stretch of land between the American and British armies, a place where allegiances were fluid and violence was a part of daily life. As he rode near the town of Tarrytown on the morning of September 23, 1780, his path was suddenly blocked by 3 men armed with muskets. These were not soldiers of the Continental Army. They were local militiamen, irregulars named John Paulding, Isaac Van Wart, and David Williams. Paulding, who had recently escaped from a British prison in New York, was wearing a Hessian soldier's coat, a common practice for ill-equipped militiamen. Seeing the coat, André made a fatal miscalculation. Believing the men to be loyalists, he foolishly declared himself to be a British officer on important business who must not be detained. Realizing his catastrophic error when the men identified themselves as Americans, he frantically tried to backtrack, producing the passport Benedict Arnold had given him under the name John Anderson. But it was too late. Their suspicions were thoroughly aroused. The militiamen led him off the road into a thicket of trees and ordered him to strip. They searched his clothes, his saddle, and his person, finding nothing. Frustrated, they were about to let him go when one of them, perhaps Paulding, insisted they check his boots. André, initially reluctant, finally complied. And there, tucked into his stockings, the militiamen found the 6 folded pieces of paper. They were not spies or intelligence officers, but they could see these were no ordinary documents. They saw the detailed engineering schematics of West Point's fortifications, the minutes from a war council meeting, and a summary of the fort's defenses, all in Benedict Arnold's unmistakable handwriting. They may not have understood the full scope of the plot, but they knew they had stumbled upon something of monumental importance. André, now desperate, tried to bribe them. He offered them his horse, his gold watch, and a promise of 100 guineas, even 10,000 guineas, and permanent provision from the British government if they would let him go. It was a tempting offer for poor men in a time of war. But these three militiamen, in a moment of extraordinary integrity that stands in stark contrast to Arnold's greed, refused. Paulding is reported to have said, "No, by God, if you would give us 10,000 guineas, you should not stir one step." They had captured a spy, and they were going to do their duty. They delivered their prisoner to the nearest American commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Jameson. Here, the plot nearly succeeded despite André's capture. Jameson, utterly baffled and unable to fathom that the hero, General Arnold, could be a traitor, made a dangerously naive decision. He penned a note to Arnold at West Point informing him that a Mr. John Anderson had been captured carrying suspicious papers. He then ordered André to be escorted to Arnold, effectively sending the captured spy back to his co-conspirator. The incriminating documents, however, Jameson sent by a separate messenger to General George Washington, who was en route to West Point. It was only the timely intervention of Major Benjamin Talmadge, Washington's astute chief of intelligence, that prevented disaster. Talmadge, arriving at the post shortly after André had departed, was immediately suspicious of the entire situation. He vehemently argued with Jameson, finally persuading him to recall André. But Jameson, stubbornly loyal to Arnold, refused to recall the note he had sent. That single message was now flying on horseback directly to Arnold's headquarters, a ticking bomb that would soon blow the conspiracy wide open. The scene on the morning of September 25th, 1780, at Arnold's headquarters, a large house on the east bank of the Hudson opposite West Point, was one of surreal calm before the storm. Arnold was hosting a breakfast for several of his officers, all of them awaiting the imminent arrival of General Washington and his party, which included Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette. Arnold was outwardly composed, playing the part of the gracious host, while inwardly his nerves must have been stretched to the breaking point. The trap was set. The British fleet was preparing to sail up the Hudson. The surrender of West Point was just hours away. As the men sat at breakfast, a tired and mud-spattered cavalry officer entered and handed Arnold the note from Jameson. Arnold broke the seal and read the words that confirmed his worst fears. André had been captured. The documents had been found. A messenger was on his way to Washington with the evidence. The plot was exposed. What followed was a masterful display of composure under unimaginable pressure. Arnold folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and, according to eyewitnesses, his face, though he was a man of dark complexion, changed to a deadly paleness. He rose from the table, calmly excused himself, and requested to speak with his wife upstairs. He told Peggy everything in a few frantic sentences. André was captured, the plot was discovered, he had to flee for his life. He left her in a state of collapse, ran downstairs, and told the waiting officers that he needed to ride to West Point immediately to prepare for General Washington's arrival. He mounted his horse and galloped at a suicidal pace down a steep path to the river's edge, where his personal barge was always kept ready. He ordered his 6 oarsmen to row for their lives downriver towards the British ship Vulture, which was still waiting miles away. To avoid being fired upon by American shore batteries, he stood in the barge and waved a white handkerchief, a sign of truce. The ruse worked. Hours later, the man who was supposed to surrender, West Point, surrendered only himself, climbing aboard the British sloop, a free man, leaving behind his country, his honor, and the wreckage of his life. Just a few hours after his escape, George Washington arrived at Arnold's headquarters. He was surprised and annoyed to find that Arnold was not there to greet him. After a perfunctory breakfast, Washington and his party crossed the river to inspect the fortifications, expecting to find Arnold there. He was nowhere to be found. It was only upon returning that afternoon that Washington was handed the packet of documents from Jameson, forwarded from his last location. Alexander Hamilton, who was present, later described the moment. Washington opened the packet and read the damning papers. The full, staggering scope of the betrayal became clear. His reaction was not one of rage, but of profound, stunned silence, followed by immense sadness. He handed the papers to Hamilton and Lafayette, and with tears in his eyes uttered the heartbroken words, "Arnold has betrayed us. Whom can we trust now?" Upstairs, Peggy Shipp and Arnold had launched into a brilliant and convincing performance. She became hysterical, shrieking and crying, her hair disheveled. She accused Washington of trying to kill her child, claimed not to recognize her husband, and played the part of a terrified, innocent woman driven to madness by the shock of it all. Her act was so compelling that the young, chivalrous Hamilton and even Washington himself were completely convinced of her innocence. They treated her with gentle sympathy and granted her safe passage to her family in Philadelphia. It was arguably the greatest acting performance of the American Revolution. For Major John André, there would be no such escape. He was tried by a board of 14 generals, including Lafayette. He did not deny his actions, comporting himself with a dignity and courage that won the admiration of his American captors. He was found guilty of being a spy and sentenced to death by hanging. He made one final request: to be executed by firing squad, the death of a soldier, not a spy. Washington, bound by the unforgiving rules of war, denied the request. On October 2nd, 1780, John André was hanged. He met his end with calm fortitude, his final words being, "I pray you to bear me witness that I meet my fate like a brave man." His death was mourned on both sides of the Atlantic as a profound tragedy. Benedict Arnold, meanwhile, had traded his honor for a commission as a brigadier general in the British Army and a payment of over £6,000, far less than the £20,000 he had demanded. He was now an officer in the service of King George III, and he seemed determined to prove his new loyalty. He penned an open letter to the inhabitants of America, justifying his actions and urging others to abandon the cause. Then he took up arms against his former countrymen. He led brutal British raids on Virginia, and most infamously on New London, Connecticut, a port town just a few miles from where he grew up. He burned ships, warehouses, and homes, solidifying his reputation in America as not just a traitor, but a cruel and vengeful monster. When the war ended in American victory, Arnold and Peggy sailed for England. He hoped to be hailed as a hero who had risked everything for the crown. Instead, he found himself a pariah. The British establishment, while having used him, fundamentally despised him. He was a traitor, a man who had broken a sacred oath. If he could betray his own country, how could he ever be truly trusted? He was publicly snubbed by the king, mocked in the press, and ostracized by the military elite. One member of Parliament, upon seeing Arnold in the gallery, famously declared that he could not speak while the infamous author of that betrayal was present, forcing Arnold to leave in humiliation. He tried to rebuild his life as a merchant, but his reputation followed him like a shadow. His business ventures failed. He was burned in effigy in America, and he lived in constant fear of being kidnapped and dragged back to face justice. He became a man without a country, a ghost haunting the margins of the empire he had tried to join. He died in London on June 14th, 1801, a lonely, bitter, and debt-ridden man of 60. A story, perhaps apocryphal but emotionally true, persists that, on his deathbed, he asked to be dressed one last time in his old Continental Army uniform. Holding the epaulets and sword knots Washington had given him, he supposedly whispered, "Let me die in this old uniform in which I fought my battles. May God forgive me for ever having put on another." The story of Benedict Arnold is more than just a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a profound and unsettling American tragedy. It is the story of how a man's greatest strengths, his ambition, his pride, his hunger for glory, can curdle into his most destructive weaknesses. He was a hero who bled for a revolution that, in his eyes, never fully loved him back. He allowed his personal grievances, his wounded pride, and his financial desperation to eclipse his patriotism, leading him down a path from which there was no return. His legacy is a powerful and enduring cautionary tale. It reminds us that history is made by complex, flawed human beings, not marble statues. It forces us to confront the corrosive nature of resentment and the devastating price of a single, catastrophic choice. Benedict Arnold's name will forever be a byword for treason in the United States, his effigy burned, his story told to frighten children. Yet, to truly understand the American Revolution, we must also remember the brilliant, brave, and deeply wounded man he once was. For in his tragic fall, we find a timeless lesson on the fragility of honor, the complexities of loyalty, and the heartbreaking reality that the line between a celebrated hero and an infamous traitor can be perilously thin.